action groups hold their own Earth Summit under the symbolic Tree of Life to monitor the work of the official conference.
The massive and growing NGO contingent at the United Nations has become a global rent-a-mob. And if you look at who is actually funding them, this becomes apparent. They are there to make the one-worlders who are grasping for power look more conservative by taking a more radical stance in many instances, and at the same time give the appearance that they are representing the people of the world, the voice of global civil society.
Another group found at many UN conferences are the so-called representatives of indigenous peoples. The UN gives the impression that these activists represent the genuine independent voice of their people.
At virtually all of the UN summits, for instance, you will see so-called representatives of indigenous peoples. You always see these same representatives miraculously showing up at these summits. They were going to come there to represent the people of their jungle or of their rainforest or of their mountain tribe. In virtually every case, they are there repeating the phrases that have been fashioned for them by these same NGO leaders who are promoting the UN line.
One of the major CFR-inspired programs to come out of Rio was Agenda 21, a massive environmentalist manifesto. A UN-approved summary notes,
effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals. There are specific actions which are intended to be undertaken by every person on Earth.
For several decades, globalists developed the idea of a permanent international criminal court with the power to try individuals. At the dawn of the 21st century, the United Nations announced specific plans to implement such a court. Proponents suggested that the demand for an ICC simply welled up in the UN General Assembly, but the Council on Foreign Relations was clearly pulling the strings.
The Council on Foreign Relations hand was very evident in the preparatory meetings for the ICC. I was at the Los Angeles conference, and Ambassador David Sheffer, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was the keynote speaker. The chairman of the event there was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as were many of the other prominent people in attendance. In addition, we see that the legal scholars like Richard Falk and others who are putting together the actual documents themselves, hammering out the wording, are also members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
In 1998, the UN convened a conference in Rome to hammer out a treaty that would establish the court. Much like the Nuremberg trials dealt with Nazi officials after World War II, proponents say the ICC will provide an impartial international venue to try tyrants and other assorted threats to world peace. In Rome, a widely read NGO publication reminded conference attendees where world justice was needed most. The primary target of condemnation by both the NGOs and the delegates was the United States.
The ICC summit turned into a huge Bash America fest. Each day, the official delegates who came to the rostrum, as well as the NGO representatives, denounced the United States, decried us for our supposed violations of human rights, of economic rights, of social injustice. Many of them explicitly stated that they wanted to use the ICC eventually to try U.S. citizens and U.S. officials for these perceived crimes.
The final day of the conference would serve as an omen. When the minimal objections of the U.S. were defeated by the rest of the delegates, the entire assembly erupted in a display of anti-American jubilation. In that brief moment, the UN delegates passed judgment. America is the principal, if not the sole, source of evil in the world. All that remained was the sentencing. The resulting 166-page Rome Statute has been submitted to individual nations for ratification. Professor Charles Rice of Notre Dame University School of Law examined the proposal for an ICC.
In our system, as a law is supposed to be, a rule of reason which, in a sense, controls the state, and the state should operate under law. I mean, there's simply no reasonable expectation that will be the case under this.
But the ICC, Rice points out, has no limits to its jurisdiction.
Claiming jurisdiction to try Americans for actions committed within the United States which fit their definition of these crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on. That is simply a repeal of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, this is outrageous.
The Rome Statute claims jurisdiction for the ICC to try any individual charged with genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. However, no reasonable consensus was reached at the Rome Conference concerning the definition of these crimes. Their definition will be left to the arbitrary interpretation of ICC judges. There are other ICC problems as well. Judges, prosecutors, and counsel can be drawn from authoritarian regimes that are resentful of Americans. The ICC will recognize no right to a trial by jury, and certainly no right to a speedy trial. An American citizen, whether in or out of the U.S., could be accused of violating an undefined UN law. He would then be tried and convicted by foreign prosecutors and judges, then sent to some undisclosed prison somewhere in the world.
Most important, we should sign and ratify the Treaty for a Permanent International Criminal Court.
The majority of ICC supporters in government cannot risk showing their hand so openly. Initially, the Clinton administration objected to some of the provisions of the ICC statute and refused to sign. Political leaders expressed similar reservations. While some of this resistance was genuine, much of it followed a familiar pattern. Many politicians will often conceal their support for radical proposals by putting on an initial show of opposition. Eventually, these false opponents reverse themselves at a strategic moment, claiming a compromise has been achieved, and the public is led to believe that its interests have been protected. Eventually, the Rome Treaty was signed by Clinton, shortly before he left office. Ratification by the U.S. Senate is all that is needed for Americans to become victims of an ICC. If a UN-controlled world government is achieved, Americans can expect their lives to change dramatically. For example, population controls would go into effect in America. These controls include mandatory abortion, modeled after China's UN-funded one-child policy. To eliminate surplus population, euthanasia and assisted suicide would be promoted. Private and home schooling would be outlawed as the UN takes control over all facets of education. New global taxes would also be imposed on Americans in addition to federal and state taxes. To transform much of the United States into wild lands habitat, millions of Americans would be relocated and miles of roads would be declared off-limits. The very right to own property would be restricted and eventually abolished altogether. All law enforcement officers would fall under control of a global UN police force. Local police would exist to serve and protect the state, not the citizens. And the entire American military would fall under the command of the UN as part of the world's most powerful force, UN peacekeepers. Their prime objective? To suppress any opposition to the United Nations. If plans for a UN-controlled world government continue unchallenged, Americans will soon discover that their constitutional protections will be gone, that resistance to the UN is impossible, and that the once mighty America is unable to defend herself against an emerging totalitarian order.